Phishing messages are the easiest way through an organization's cyber defenses, but you can make the criminals' jobs much more difficult. Today, on this episode of the CyberWatch Expert Series. Welcome to the CyberWatch Expert Series. I'm your host, Curtis Franklin. Today, I'm talking with Michael Sviben, co-founder of DomainGuard. We're going to be talking with Michael about phishing messages in email, SMS, or other media that try to convince the victim to do a criminal's work for them. We're going to hear Michael explain what forms the messages take, the technology that can help defend against them, and just how effective training employees can be. And now, my conversation with Michael Sviben. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. We truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Curtis, for having me on. I appreciate it as well.
Well, I want to begin by asking you a little bit about, the path that has led to you sitting down with me this morning. How did you get to where you are in your career?
I started out my career in IT, right? That's kind of where you start off, help desk, desktop support, and kind of work your way up, right? And then eventually I found my way into cybersecurity space, right? So deploying email products, right? Like web proxies, email secure gateways. And then eventually I found my way leading into more of the offensive security space, right? So, throughout my career, I've taken both individual contributor roles as well as leadership roles. And then that allowed me to essentially develop a deep technical expertise while leading essentially teams, right? That, had tremendous expertise, right? And then we, performing complex security engagements, but essentially, doing offensive security for the past 15 years has been very rewarding, right? For me as an individual, right? And also helping customers.
Well, that offensive role, the red teaming, is one that I know a lot of people get into and love, and it's certainly useful for companies. But today, rather than red teaming specifically, we're going to be talking about one particular avenue into an infrastructure. And that is really sort of exploiting the humans who are involved in the chain through phishing. And I know that there are a lot of different attacks that use messaging of various sorts. How do you define phishing specifically?
Yeah, so I would say phishing is, defined as a way to entice an individual to, one, either click on a malicious link, right? So there's some type of pretexting that happens, right? There's phone phishing, right? Is another one. There's also SMS phishing, right? Where you get a text message with a phishing link, and it just keeps evolving, right? There's, AI now, right? Where, you're now getting, phished through, some advanced also voice phishing, right? As well. So it just keeps constantly evolving with these threat actors. So you really have to stay vigilant. But phishing is not going away, right? It's on the rise essentially, right? And how do you combat it is probably an interesting topic as well, right? And what people are doing, in my opinion, is just another topic that we could kind of just figure out and try to solve, right? But it's kind of currently unsolvable. But there are steps that individuals can take, right, to protect themselves.
Well, we're going to get into that. What can you do about it in just a few minutes? But I'd like to drill down a little bit on this evolving nature of phishing, because most of us think that phishing is just a message that contains a URL. You click on it and you have been phished. Is that the only thing that goes on or can go on in a phishing message?
It's more than just clicking on a URL. You can be phished getting personal information through just the email message, right? It doesn't have to be clicking on a link and then getting compromised that way. There's a lot of individuals now that are being targeted from a candidate perspective. So if you're job hunting, so what we've been seeing in the industry is that individuals are, brands are getting impersonated, right, through typo squatting domains, and we can talk about domain typo squatting as well. But essentially, these victims are becoming victimized essentially by getting these email messages and then asking for personal information for, being recruited from a prospective employer. So they pass over their, phone number, right, to set up, another step in the process, right, to collect information from the individual.
Is phishing always about personal information?
It's not always about personal information. It's about obtaining information, even from a corporate perspective, right, to get access to, and maybe it is just, credentials, right, or session tokens, and kind of breaking into, or as like an initial access vector to getting into an organization. But it is collecting information, and whether a username and password is personal, right? So, or is it owned by the corporate user, right? Or, but a personal user, it is about getting that information, right? And then taking it to the next step, in my opinion, and kind of the industry's view.
It was interesting to me because a moment ago you mentioned job candidates being phished. I know a lot of people think that there are specific roles in a company, specific job titles, specific individuals who are going to be more likely to get phishing messages than others are. But it sounds to me like, from what you just said, that virtually anyone could receive a phishing message.
Yeah, absolutely. It's these threat actors do not necessarily care about who the individual is, right? And maybe they do, like certain threat actors will care about the individual, but there's other threat actors, if you want to call them that, or script kiddies that kind of just want to target anyone, right? So no one is immune to not receiving a phishing email, right? So anyone can be victimized, right, through email phishing or phone phishing or SMS phishing. It's just, a compounding issue that is just, again, not going away, right? It's nearly on the rise, right? We're seeing a lot of people become victimized. Like, my parents get targeted, my daughter gets targeted. I'm constantly hearing more and more stories, even from family members, saying, hey, this friend of mine got victimized, right, through a phishing email, through recruiting, or victimized through some other mechanism. And it's just, what can they do to help? And it's really to stay vigilant, right, at the end of the day.
Interesting to me that you talk about stay vigilant. And we're going to get towards that. But before we get to the vigilance, I disagree with some of the industry experts, because I hear people say your users are your first line of defense. And to me, if it gets to the user, that means you've had a technology failure somewhere along the way. So let's start out with, is there any technology that can be deployed that helps with phishing?
Yeah, and there are a lot of technologies, right? And from being on the defensive side by deploying web proxies and email, secure email gateways, there are technologies that you can deploy at the perimeter gateways, right, to protect your employees, right, and your business. But it's challenging to protect your customers as well. So that's another issue that's impacting everyone. But there have been advancements in like spam technology or anti-spoofing technology in these gateways. And there's something called DMARC, right, which is domain-based message authentication, reporting and conformance. And that's essentially it's basically an email authentication mechanism that can help prevent someone from using your domain, right, your business domain, from sending, abusive emails, right? So you're basically authenticating that legitimate emails coming from only these servers, right? So there are things that businesses can do to put in place other than the spam technologies, and setting it up inside their DNS, right, or where they register their DNS records. There's a lot of things that they can do from that angle to help prevent someone from spoofing their domain. But it doesn't help prevent against typo squatting domains, right? That's impersonating your business, right? That's a little bit more challenging.
Before we leave this, I've got to ask, you talked about DMARC, you talked about some of the other techniques. Are these the sort of things that a small to mid-sized business can employ, or are these limited to the largest enterprises?
No, small businesses, right, can set this up. Like if they purchase a domain, there's options for when they're setting up their email, right, their email connectivity, right, using that domain, they can set up these policies, right, through DNS. It's readily available. I don't think it costs anything, honestly, to set this up, but you do need to understand what you're setting up, right, and how to do it. And there's a lot of instructions and manuals that you can set up from your registrar or or your DNS provider to set up all this stuff. You just have to go ahead and do it, right, and configure it.
It's amazing. We hear that all the time. The tools are available, but you do have to use them for them to be effective.
Yeah, it's not by default, unfortunately.
You know, we were launching down the path of the individuals. And, you know, sometimes within their role in a company, sometimes off there. And I want to talk later on about how to help protect your company. But one of the things we hear all the time is you've got to train your users. You've got, you know, education, training, that's what it takes. So you go out and you find some program that will train your users. There are a lot of companies out there that provide this. Have you now solved the problem?
No, haven't solved the problem. But training, you know, and we used to do, you know, phishing engagements, right, on the offensive security side. So whether it's, you know, very realistic, right, it's really it's essentially what you want to do, right? If you're doing any kind of phishing training, you know, anyone can set up, you know, with some of these companies and have these emails, but now users are essentially checking the message headers to see if that header is in there. That's, you know, hey, this is a phishing test, right? So users are kind of catching on to the phishing training, right? Essentially, it's very easy to do to kind of look at the message properties and just check for those tokens or those headers. But, you know, you should still constantly test your users, but more from a realistic perspective. It is challenging as well when you're doing phishing training because you can't impersonate other legitimate brands like FedEx or Walmart, because, you know, that could be, you know, from a litigation perspective, that could, you know, you can get in hot water essentially, right? So you have to be mindful that is a realistic attack scenario, right, that these threat actors will deploy, right, or utilize. So there is still some limitations in your phishing training that you have to, you know, understand essentially, right, when you're conducting those tests.
Well, when you're conducting those tests, is this the sort of thing, and again, for a company or an organization with finite resources, is this the sort of thing that can be done by an internal IT group or security group, or is this something where you really need to think about budgeting for an external group to perform that testing for you?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, right? Because there could be some talented individuals internally, right, that want to do this, right, and learn it, and anyone can kind of learn it, right? You know, there's a lot of training that's out there, and the industry will help you as well, right? Kind of if you want to set it up yourself, but if you don't have the time to execute and constantly do it, right, then yeah, you know, definitely want to budget like a third party provider to execute some of those advanced phishing tests, right, for you, just because they see what's going on in the wild, right? They have their ear to the ground essentially, and they're constantly doing it for other organizations, and then they're also testing the strengths of your security controls as well. So it's not just the individual, you're testing the security controls of what has been implemented in your organization to either block those phishing attempts, but also what happens after, right? If you're able to bypass those controls, because not all controls are equal, but if you are successful in bypassing those controls, you kind of want to see where your gaps are, right, in your security defenses as well.
A few years ago, I know I was talking to some red team folks, and they said that some of their clients didn't want them to go throw phishing tests against the users because they didn't want to make the users feel bad. Is that something that you run into when you're talking to customers, that tension between being effective in the training and maintaining the enthusiasm and morale of the employees?
Yeah. And another good question, right? Because we've come up I've personally come up across that situation, right? Where you are targeting individuals, but you kind of want to randomize it, right? You don't want to specifically say, hey, I'm going after this individual. So, when you're speaking with HR or your buyer, right, essentially, you kind of want to have those conversations and let them know it's going to be, it's semi-targeted, but it's not, fully targeted, right? It's, randomized for this, this group, right, in the business organization, and you kind of select a handful of individuals and maybe, select another handful of individuals from another part of the organization. But it is a topic of discussion that is important. But I've also been on, the conversations where, it's also a rewarding mechanism. You kind of want to make it like a gamified, right? So if someone passes that phishing test, right, they should be rewarded, right? But if someone doesn't pass the test, they shouldn't be, ostracized, right? Or, at the end of the day, they shouldn't be targeted to say, hey, you failed this test. I think it's constant reinforcement, and doing it in a diplomatic way, right, with the end user that may have failed that test, right, and just having the conversation that you just want to see where you are, and kind of maybe you even anonymize it, right, from a metrics perspective if you want to see the metrics, and you don't say, hey, this person failed, this person fails. You just, this department has some issues, right, or some gaps in phishing, right. So you can kind of take it a step up. If you wanted to. And then maybe even, maybe you have a conversation with your, the line manager, and the line manager essentially will, have a conversation with their entire group and say, hey, there was a phishing test. There was a number of folks that you need to work on it, and maybe even show what the phishing, the phishing email looked like. Because if that individual, because now you're not calling out the specific individual, but that individual is now understanding, right? Hey, oh, I remember seeing that email. But you're not calling out that individual, right? Is probably the more diplomatic way to do it.
The way that you're talking about doing this sounds intuitively like a great approach to take, but there are a bunch of different approaches depending on who you work with and all that. Are you aware of anyone, an organization, an agency, anybody who has what amounts to best practices for protecting your organization from phishing? I know there are such things for some other areas of security, but are there best practices for phishing?
Everyone's going to say, training, right? I mean, majority of people, and as we talked, a few minutes ago, that's what everyone is saying. Just have a training program. But I think it's, the best practice, and maybe that's not the right term to use, but I think the right thing to do is to have a layered approach. Right. And that layered approach is your security controls, right? At the perimeter network, coupled with your training, your advanced phishing, right? To not just do your formal training, and, gamify it in a way, right? Like make it fun for people at the end of the day. And you're still collecting your metrics and you're figuring out, is training working, but also testing your defenses, right? And you're not just looking for signatures, right? There's a lot of technologies out there that, have, implemented machine learning or, artificial intelligence that can kind of look at the page in real time and see if it is a phishing. So there's, those technologies cost more money, and maybe other, smaller businesses can't afford some of those higher cost products. But I feel like these other companies that are out there that, could spend, $100,000-$200,000 for their email gateways or their platforms, but maybe even the industry needs to change. Security technology companies probably need to change as well and say, hey, maybe we can offer this for, cheaper for like small mid-sized businesses, right? That can't afford the higher price tag. But again, that's my opinion. I don't know if, these technology companies would agree with it, but, I think we have to all help out, right? And give back at the end of the day.
It's hard to believe, but we're coming down towards the end of our time together. And one of the things that I'm curious about, someone who's been listening to our conversation has heard a lot of great information. You've been wonderful that way. But if there were just one or two key thoughts that you wanted to leave someone with when it comes to protecting their organization from phishing, what might those one or two keys be?
You want to be proactive, right? So you want to monitor for like typo squatting. We talked about typo squatting a little bit. Typo squatting is essentially when someone is impersonating your brand, right? So it may not be specifically looking like your brand, but they have variations of what your company domain would look like. And being proactive and monitoring for those newly registered domains and blocking those, right, as they come up, right, is essentially. So having that perimeter monitoring, right, or external monitoring is advantageous and being more proactive. But also, I would say that the companies need to have a workflow process, right? And that workflow process is if someone external, like a customer, does get victimized with a typo squatting or phishing email impersonating your brand, you need to have that process and take that in, and then also report that to the registrars, because you can have the registrars take that domain down if you have enough evidence, essentially, right? And send that to them. And that's just another step, right, that you want to be proactive and say, look, this domain was used. We have the evidence. Send that to the registrars or the registries or the hosting provider, right, whoever that may be, and have that part of the workflow process and not ignore those, right? Because, we're all of us, right, whether it's internal or, someone that was victimized, don't let it go unnoticed, right, or, unanswered, and send that out to those registrars and try to get the domains taken down, right? So we all have to do our part in trying to protect everyone else, right, from getting victimized by those phishing domains as well.
Much as we might like to pretend it's not, it really is a community out there, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And there's resources out there. And I think, we'll send over some blog postings that we wrote up, and then also some links that, even individuals can use to search for those domains, right, that come up through their phone phishing or their email phishing. Just check and verify those domains. And we'll have some resources and some links that you can send to them as well, that they can check those domains to see if they're fraudulent.
You mentioned blog posts. So my last question is, if someone has been listening to this conversation and says, boy, I'd like to learn more from Michael, I'd like to keep up with him, how can they do that? Do you blog? You've got a social media presence. How can they keep up with you?
So I work for a company called DomainGuard. I'm actually the co-founder. So essentially, you can go to guardyourdomain.com, and then we have a blog posting where we talk about phishing and the types of phishing. So it's, whenever we get a chance to write a blog that's important, that's going to be impactful for users to understand, they can go to our website and then look for our blog posting. Outstanding.
Well, Michael Sviben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and look forward. It sounds like there are a number of other topics we could explore. Look forward to having you on again.
Yeah. Thank you again, Curtis, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, that was my conversation with Michael Sviben. We appreciate Michael taking the time to be with us today. Join me next week for the CyberWatch Expert Series, when I'll have another experienced expert who will help you gain the information you need to be more successful at making your organization cyber secure. This podcast has been brought to you by Access Point Consulting. Follow along with the CyberWatch Expert Series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And as always, you can learn more about Access Point Consulting at www.accesspointconsulting.com. I'm Curtis Franklin. We'll see you next week.